Thanks very much. Welcome to the Frontline Club and this meeting on the Marikana massacre and what it means for South Africa. Everybody saw the pictures, I'm sure, and anyone who remembers those footage of South Africa in the 80s and earlier than that of blue-suited police firing into crowds of Africans demonstrating will have felt that terrible frisson of haven't we been here before? But obviously, clearly in a very different context. And it seemed to come from nowhere. But I think what we'll learn tonight is that there were already trends beginning to emerge, and that a spark like that obviously set it off. I just was, when I began to dig into it a little deeper, was just absolutely astounded to find not only that Cyril Ramaphosa, the great union leader from the 80s, who had balanced his role as a trade union leader with a real fight against apartheid, which is quite a difficult balancing act, but he did it brilliantly, and then had become the chief negotiator for the ANC in the transition, was on the board of this Lonmin company, and that Lonmin itself was Lonro, the old Tiny Roland company that had ripped off Africa all the way since the 60s. I mean, in these appalling mines and plantations and so on. I remember visiting some of them and writing about them. A most appalling man. And that this, and not only that, but the Benchmark Foundation, which is one of Desmond Tutu's organizations, had written a damning report about it only 6 months before, and the company did not appear to have responded to it at all. The world did respond. Moody's downgraded South Africa for the first time since apartheid ended from an A3 to a BAA1. Is that right? That's right. Yeah. A whole raft of strikes began. The truckers, other mining companies, and even factory workers. Now, in such a situation as that, you'd expect there to be political repercussions. But what I think we'll see tonight is that actually there is no alternative. The government will continue as before. So it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how this plays out. Our speakers tonight, I will introduce them as they speak rather than introduce everybody at once. First of all, Terry Bell, who's a journalist of very long-standing on South Africa, working both here and in South Africa, now based in Cape Town, and specializing in political and economic analysis, and will give us a sense of the context in which this happened. Terry.
Thank you, Richard. The thing is, the context is all important. I've not concentrated too much on. Everyone knows about the 34 miners killed in the massacre. In fact, there were 44 deaths, because this incident started some days before the 16th, when the main massacre took place. And one needs to understand that in the first place, but I also did not concentrate on that for the simple reason that this is merely the worst, the most brutal, the most bloody of thousands of so-called, I love what the police use, a lovely euphemism, unrest incidents that we've had around the country. We have them on an almost daily basis. Now, some of them could be a march that is not legal, not permission not given. It could be burning barricades. It could be the stoning of a councillor's residence. It could be anything like that. The difference this time is that it has happened within organized labor, within the mining community. So therefore, the knock-on effect and the coherence, the demand for better wages, better conditions, has therefore spread much more quickly, and also has spread to all sorts of sectors of the labor movement. As Richard mentioned, it's not just the mines and the truckers. There are retail workers out on strike. There are metal workers out on strike. This is an extraordinarily complex situation, and unfortunately, it has been dealt with, I feel, in many ways, far too simplistically by concentrating on this one incident of these horrific deaths. I mean, one needs to ask questions like, who sent in a special squad of police that are hand-picked? A lot of us refer to them as the killer squad. They're people who carry AK-47 rifles, R5 rifles. They carry very heavy munitions because they deal with armed heist gangs. Do you send in a group like that to deal with a strike? But one needs to ask that question. Who then also gave the order to equip them with live ammunition? These are questions that have to be asked. But much more importantly, we have to ask is why, 18 years after we've had our transition, we still have single-sex hostels on these mines for migrant workers where they stack, literally stack, workers on bunks, 3-tier concrete bunks, like so many artifacts in a bloody museum. We still have that. And then, of course, the difference being we can't enforce that anymore. It was never legally required under the apartheid regime either. It was just the cheapest way of doing it. Can't do that anymore. So what you do, the mining companies say, right, we will give a living out allowance of 1,500 to 1,800 rand a month. Quite honestly, it's totally inadequate. But to live out, these people move out of the hostels because at least they want some privacy. But now in the Platinum Belt, there's another complicating factor. The land, courtesy of the old apartheid regime, is tribal land belonging to the Bafokeng, the Royal Bafokeng. Their people don't work on the mines. It's migrant laborers, particularly from the Eastern Cape, who speak Xhosa, and from Lesotho, from Swaziland and Mozambique. The Bafokeng don't want them settling there and bringing their families in. So they don't allow amenities to be provided. But Bafokeng, what do they call shack farmers, build one-roomed hovels, which they rent out to these farmers, to these miners, at 500 to 800 rand a month, in which they raise families, etc. But they also are, in the rural areas from which they come, they are the sole breadwinners. They support families of up to 15 people. Now that is the actual background. The Benchmarks Foundation that Richard mentioned actually wrote a report 6 months ago, but they also did another report in February when there was an outbreak, a so-called unprotected strike at Impala Platinum nearby. And at the time, the Benchmarks Foundation said something has got to be done. This is a powder keg. Interestingly enough, the General Secretary of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, Zwelenzima Vavi, also said this is a time bomb that is going to explode. But nobody did anything about it. Now, one report that did come in from a monitor who had not seen it himself but had a report from the miners said that how this incident began was that the rock drill operators, who are the elite among miners, and they work in the most horrendous conditions in little stopes, which are tunnels 1 to about 1.5 meters wide, with 45 kilo drills, and they work on bonuses. The more you work, the faster you work, the better you get paid. They wanted more money. They wanted a basic rate of 12,500. The mining companies came back, and you might have seen it reported here saying, but they nearly get that anyhow with their bonuses. Not strictly true, because there's another complicating factor that needs to be taken account of, and has not, as far as I'm concerned, I've not seen it published anywhere, that the majority of mining companies now increasingly turn to contract labor. They turn to labor brokers. For example, Aquarius Platinum, which is a small operation, there are 11,000 miners. 9,000 of them are labor brokers. So the companies will pay the going minimum rate to a company that will then employ miners at whatever they can get them for. So this thing of 4,000 rand, which was published in The Guardian, is actually true among certain contract workers. That's the background. And unless we look at that entire background, and nothing makes sense. And to concentrate only on the killings, on the police, on who pulled which trigger, who shot first, would be the biggest mistake we make. Because this thing is going to have severe repercussions, but they're repercussions that have been building throughout the last 5 years. The number of unrest incidents has got increased and have got much worse and much more violent. It's understandable, because one thing you should bear in mind is that in real terms we have an unemployment rate in excess of 40% and no real social welfare net. What do you expect? It's going to happen.
Thank you, Terry. All right, give me a round of applause. Very good.
Thanks.
Our second speaker is Audrey Brown, who I'm sure most of you know as the presenter on BBC Focus on Africa and on Network Africa. And you went down there straight after it happened and did some reporting from there.
No, what happened was we were following the story. I was here in London on the day that Terry talks about, the Tuesday when the 10 people were killed, including the police. I interviewed the police and they explained from their point of view, what had happened. And then when the 34 were killed. Now, the time that I interviewed the spokesperson for the National Union of Mine Workers, Lisiba Sishoka is his name. We didn't know yet that 34 people had been killed. But by that time, it was 18 people, and it was sort of towards the end of the day. And I remember saying to him, so 18 people killed by the police. This is shocking. And his response actually was even more shocking. What he said was, well, the police sent out a very strong signal to these people: we will not be held to ransom, there will be no disorder, etc. The response was just astonishing. If you know, the National Union of Mine Workers is supposed to represent and protect these workers and speak for them. That was the message he was, and I was doing the interview, and in a way I was glad that the interview wasn't live, because I kept saying to him, but are you sure that you mean what you say? You speak for these people. Have you lost control of these people? Do you know what's happening on the mine? And he kept the message that the police will not allow this country to descend into chaos, and we will not be held to ransom. What I felt then, as a South African, was an absolute sense of speechless horror, because even though Terry says that South Africa has been becoming more and more tense and uneasy, and there's a greater sense, I feel, among South Africans that things are going awry, I don't think it was as stark and as clear as Marikana. That really, for very many people, was the absolute shock of it, the shock of what had happened, and the shock of what it implies, and the shock of what it means in our society. Because then I went to South Africa, and I was in South Africa listening. I wasn't reporting, I was doing a completely different story, but listening to and reporting, listening to the reports about it and listening to the responses to it. Coincidentally, I was doing something called the Africa Debate, and we were going to discuss the issue of color and inequality in South Africa, and the implication, what color still, what attaches to color in South Africa. And we were going to do it with a group of 18-year-olds, people who were as old as the democratic South Africa, born in 1994. They're a new generation. They've just finished school or about to finish school, go to university, start jobs or whatever. And what was fascinating was that Marikana definitely colored their understanding of what South Africa was about, and what South Africa, because at first, and they were from all over. They were, people who go to township school, people who go to schools in formerly whites-only suburbs, and mixed schools and private schools. What was interesting is that they recognized in a very vague sort of way what Marikana actually means, and they started talking about, well, there's clearly something wrong in our country, because we went to the Apartheid Museum just outside, a very cynically constructed building right outside a casino called the Gold Reef Casino. I can't tell you, the story about that is just something else. Built by two brothers who had made their money selling skin lightening creams to black women in South Africa. And that, in a way, should tell you a whole lot, because they got political buy-in by the political class, the ANC in South Africa, in the early 90s to do this project. And their thinking was, people can come, go to the casinos, even stay at the casino, and then nip across and see apartheid, and then nip across again and go and continue gambling. Anyway, we went to the Apartheid Museum. Actually, it's a very beautiful, very thoughtful. The architects moved completely away from that premise and constructed something very, very profound. I took a group of young 18-year-old South Africans, one black woman and one white woman, together at university to talk about this whole thing. When you go to the Apartheid Museum, you walk in and you're classified white or black, and then you walk a little way through and you kind of have a vague idea of, you can't go there and they can't go, you can't get married, you can't have sex with each other. That's the level at which it was for 18-year-olds in a way. But they started seeing these things, that you had to carry this document, you had to do this, you had to do that because you were black or because you were white. And they were visibly wilting, you know, visibly, like, what do you mean? And they experienced it for maybe 3 minutes. And then we started talking. We walked through, we saw Hendrik Verwoerd, who's the, I suppose they'd call him the architect of apartheid, but anyway. He making the speech when South Africa left the Commonwealth, saying, you know, you need good fences to make good neighbors. We saw Steve Biko's, you know, a little thing of Steve Biko talking about we will have no color, we'll only have the human race, and everybody in South Africa will be the same race and the same color. What was interesting for me about the experience with those two young women in the wake of Marikana was that they had, when I spoke to them before we went to South Africa, before Marikana, they were all sunshine and light about this country and how wonderful it was. After Marikana, there was absolutely no sense of that whatsoever. They were profoundly unsettled by what had happened, and that was the experience of everybody. And when the Commission of Inquiry, I suppose is what it's called, was announced, and they started sitting just a few days ago, and they postponed, you know, they'll start again. I found this reaction from a man, his name is Masita Hoyane, and he's from Pretoria East. He's just written, you know, a little blog. And and for me, this again stopped my heart and made me think again about what Marikana means for South Africa. He says, some will worry about trivial details such as who fired first, which finger, at what angle and what speed. But the fundamental point is the system that breeds the conditions for violent confrontation. Terry spelled some of those out. And he says, exploitation, by the way, was the prime purpose of apartheid, and its eradication was the prime purpose of the struggle. We can scrape the surface and look for scapegoats, usually the victims themselves, or we can be honest about policy decisions and the socio-economic trajectory they put society on. It seems like a workers against police conflict, but that is only superficially, and one must add, deceptively so. Please give us an understanding and do not proffer nonsense to cloak the truth. This was just a profound plea from an ordinary South African looking at the news and saying, yes, because Jacob Zuma immediately, well, not immediately, but announced that there will definitely be, you know, well, this is not a time for pointing fingers, that was the Minister of Mines. You know, this is a time for mourning. This is a time for us to, you know, to bound together as a nation. And yet the nation was looking at its leadership and saying, what has brought us here? Why are we here? How could this possibly happen? I have another set of questions by one of those leaders. His name is Trevor Manuel, and he is now a sort of super duper minister in South Africa, isn't he?
Minister in the presidency, yes.
Yeah.
Economic planning.
Yeah. But he was one of the most credible ministers in, you know, Nelson Mandela's cabinet, Thabo Mbeki's cabinet. And at the time that Jacob Zuma became president of the ANC and then the country, apparently his buy-in to the idea of him as Jacob Zuma as the president was pivotal to whether or not the ANC could continue as a credible organization if we had somebody like Jacob Zuma as our president and somebody like Trevor Manuel now backing out of the arrangement. So Trevor Manuel, it seems, was key and is key to understand, you know, to South Africa's credibility. South Africans might not think this, but there you are. Trevor Manuel was giving a lecture at the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation annual. Ahmed Kathrada is another stalwart of the struggle, was one of the people who wrote the Constitution, etc. Trevor Manuel is talking about leadership and leadership for nation building. And he asks these questions. What do recent events mean for our sense of nationhood? Has trust broken down completely? I can hear the answer to that question, yes, but it took Marikana for us to realize that trust has broken down completely, I think, in South Africa. I live here in London. I go to South Africa a lot. But my sense of how South Africa has evolved over the last 5 years at least is that up to Marikana, I feel, or maybe slightly before, slightly after, there was still a sense in which people felt that South Africa was rescuable, that, you know, things might change, or and I think that maybe lots of people feel that we particularly naive, or we cling to a particular belief of the ANC, that we will not abandon the idea that the ANC does have the best interests of the people of South Africa at heart, in spite of everything that has gone on for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years in South Africa. So, Trevor, yeah, trust has broken down completely. So he says, what do these events mean for the leadership of the tripartite alliance, whose components are credited with leading from the depths of oppression and exploitation to the present? Now, the tripartite alliance, of course, is the axis that forms the ANC and the governing class in South Africa, the trade union movement, the South African Communist Party, and the African National Congress. I think to talk about the trade union movement as I think the trade union movement is not one thing, but the fact that so many former leaders of the struggle, you talked about Cyril Inlonman, but there's a whole lot more. There's Gwede Mantashe, who was just past Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers. He is on the board of a mining company. His company is on the board of a mining company. It's just impossible to separate mining bosses and former trade union owners at the moment. Must I wrap up? All right. Okay. So there are more questions, but what I wondered was, if he's asking those questions and we are supposed to be looking to him for answers, where does that leave the rest of us? Where does that leave the rest of South Africa? Speechless with horror, I think. Speechless with horror.
Thank you, Audrey. We're just going to have a pause here, because I can see 1 or 2 empty seats, and there are people standing at the back. If anybody's sitting next to an empty seat, it's difficult to see from the back, you can just put your hand up, and then people could come and take them. Yeah?
There are a few down here as
and there's
well.
some down here on the sofa. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, yep. Great. Okay. Our third speaker this evening is Andrew Feinstein, who was an ANC Member of Parliament, and kind of fell out with the party and the president, I think, in no small way, and as a result was then able to write After the Party, which was his experience of working inside the ANC, and it's a great read. And also then went on to, having got involved in the corruption issue, wrote The Shadow World, a great, thumping great tome on the global arms trade, which is great. But Andrew, yeah, tell us more about what's happening inside the ANC and that tripartite ruling group. I mean, what do you think's going on there? What are they saying?
I think, Richard, to understand what's going on within the ANC, let me first say that I think for many of us who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in the early years of South Africa's democracy, the Marikana tragedy was a hugely symbolic moment. And in addition to the tragedy itself of those people who died, of the disconnection between ordinary South Africans and those who rule them in the very complex ways that Terry and Audrey were talking about, there was a moment that truly shocked me. And that was when our new Commissioner of Police made the statement very soon after the shootings that the police had nothing to apologize for. Which reminded me, very sadly, of the statement of perhaps the most brutal and odious of the apartheid justice ministers, Jimmy Kruger, who, on hearing about Steve Biko's death, which was at the hands of the apartheid security forces, said, "His death leaves me cold." And that such a comment could be made by a person in such a senior position in our democratic dispensation about mine workers shot dead by our own police force was truly horrifying for me. I I think a crucial point that Terry made as well, that we should just reiterate in trying to understand what's going on within the ANC and its alliance, is that Paul Holden, in his recent book, Who Rules South Africa, estimates that every year over 2 million South Africans are involved in some form of local level social protest against the state of governance, the levels of corruption, and the lack of service delivery. And I think that's the sort of context that Terry was painting for us, which is extremely important to understand. So Marikana was perhaps the most graphic representation, given the socio-economic circumstances in which those miners work and live, of the fact that so little has changed economically in the democratic South Africa. Yes, there is this tiny ruling elite that is predominantly black, but that has all of these conflicts of interests in terms of their business interests, often in direct conflict with the positions that they hold in government or in the party. The lack of capacity of the South African government outside of a small handful of key departments was also graphically illustrated, I think, by the police response. Because there are a whole range, as Audrey has suggested, there are a whole range of ways of interpreting it. One is that these people are either inappropriately trained, as you suggested, or that this is actually a repressive response to what is growing disillusionment with a lack of socio-economic delivery. But then most profound for me was that Marikana reflected the level of disconnection between the majority of ordinary South Africans, working South Africans who are working in very difficult, very poorly paid jobs to scrape together a living. The 40% unemployed people in the country and those who rule in their name as the servants of the people, which is what we were always told in Parliament we were. We've heard about Cyril Ramaphosa, we've heard about Gwedi Mantashe, Kgalema Motlanthe, the country and the party's deputy president, and a prospective rival to Jacob Zuma at the party's elective conference, which will take place in December of this year at Mangaung, was also the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers. So,
No.
they've,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Hmm?
Yes.
So the stark reality of their historical roles and their current roles as part of that ruling elite, and that Marikana happened on the watch of the National Union of Mine Workers, partly as a consequence of frustration of the workers with their union, also raises questions about the disconnection of the labor movement from some of the people it is representing. And I think raises some very interesting questions, Terry, that you might want to comment on in Q&A, about COSATU and its position, and whether a number of its members, or people who perhaps should be its members, worrying that COSATU has become so much a part of the small ruling elite that their own individual material interests, in some instances, have become more important than the workers they are meant to represent. In terms of where this leaves the ANC and the alliance, I personally believe I had a strange experience in South Africa when my first book After the Party came out. I had fairly recently then been an MP and had left after having a very public falling out with Mbeki about a $10 billion arms deal that we neither needed and where we could have been spending the money on the almost 6 million people who required antiretrovirals at the time and weren't able to afford them, and they weren't provided through the public health system. $300 million of bribes were paid on the deal, if you're wondering why, in fact, the deal took place. And when I produced this book, I remember being in the studios of the SABC, and the person who was interviewing me on television slammed the book down in front of me and said, "This is just a campaign endorsement for Tokyo Sexwale," who at the time was a sort of a very peripheral candidate in the election, which was effectively between Zuma and Mbeki at Polokwane. And when I suggested to the interviewer that if he'd read the book, he'd understood that it wouldn't exactly be the most complimentary endorsement of Sexwale for the presidency, I then also proceeded to say that I didn't feel that either Thabo Mbeki or Jacob Zuma were morally fit to lead the ANC or South Africa, at which point he terminated the interview. But the difference between them was that Mbeki had a degree of technocratic competence that, while many disagreed with the direction of some of that competence, particularly in the field of economic policy, there was a sense of the building of a government and of some capacity in that government, which during the Zuma administration has just collapsed. And I would characterize the Zuma administration as one of serial ineptitude. And in fact, I would say that many governments in many parts of the world are serially inept. However, in a country like South Africa and even poorer countries, a competent, honest, and effective government is a desperate requirement, especially of the poorest in that society, whatever Mitt Romney might think about the 47%. Sure. And I think that where we are after Marikana is perhaps the biggest indictment of where we are in South Africa at the moment. And that is that it's going to make absolutely no difference in terms of what happens within the ANC, certainly in the short term. As we were talking before we started speaking, Terry was just telling us that COSATU, the Trade Union Federation, and the South African Communist Party, the ANC's allies, have recently, just in the last day or so, decided to endorse Jacob Zuma for re-election at the Mangaung conference, which effectively puts paid to the chances of Kgalema Motlanthe, Tokyo Sexwale, or anybody else challenging him. So that the country is looking at another 6.5 years of a man who simply shouldn't be president. And that, for me, is perhaps the greatest tragedy of Marikana. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Johnny Steinberg is a South African writer and scholar. He's written several books, including Midlands and The Number, which won South Africa's premier non-fiction award, and the Sunday Times Alan Paton Prize. And he's currently a lecturer in African Studies at Oxford. Johnny, can you tell us more about what you see the future as being? And Andrew's just taken us as far as the probable re-election of Zuma, but how do you see the broader South Africa developing now?
Thanks, Richard. Well, I absolutely agree with Andrew that very little is going to change in the short term, but I think that a great deal will change in the medium term as a result of Marikana, and I want to explain why. In the last week, I've seen both in the New York Times and in the Financial Times an analysis that this is the beginning of an Arab Spring in South Africa, the beginning of a popular revolt. And I think that is, firstly, absolutely not the case. We don't see any signs of that at all. But moreover, I think it's a symptom of a very old and very lazy way of thinking about South Africa in general. I mean, South Africa as a territory is 102 years old. And right at the beginning, in 1910, well, from the beginning in 1910 until now, there's always been, in the mainstay, in mainstream South African opinion, an announcement that the country is about to explode. The first was Prime Minister Jan Smuts, who incessantly spoke of racial conflagration and the country exploding. And by the way, was the first South African head of state to oversee a massacre in 1919. In fact, oversaw two. So he joins Jacob Zuma joins him in that company. The National Party came to power in 1948 on the warning that black urbanization was going to cause an explosion in South Africa. Those who fought the National Party in later years said the National Party doesn't go, there will be an explosion in South Africa. Thabo Mbeki said that if we don't change quickly enough, the masses will not wait and will explode. Jacob Zuma has said that if we don't undo what Mbeki did, there's a time bomb and we will explode. It's become a South African trope. It's the way South Africans think about themselves. And the problem with that is it bifurcates South Africa into two possibilities. Either there is order or there's explosion. And of course, South Africa is considerably more complicated than that. And the problem with that binary is that it obscures the real. It obscures everything in between, and the whole of the world happens in between. With great respect to the New York Times and the FT, I think we must put this binary away in order to understand what's going on. Short of explosion, I think that something very important is going to happen. I absolutely take Terry's point that Marikana should not be seen in isolation. There's much context around it. At the same time, it is symbolically of enormous import. It is a democratic government slaughtering its own people. It seems as if some were taken out individually, assassination style. The consequences are enormous. What are those consequences? I think that the first important consequence over the medium term is going to be a fairly dramatic change in voter behavior. At the moment, poor black South Africans are voted at a greater rate than middle-class black South Africans. And poor black South Africans voted at a greater rate for the ANC than middle-class black South Africans. I think that that is going to change. I think that in the years after Marikana, much more numbers of poor people are going to stay away from the polls. I don't think they're going to revolt. I don't think that they're going to join an opposition party. I think they will simply stop voting. And level of voter participation is going to decline precipitously, I think. That's an enormous event in South African history, because until now there has been almost a paradox that those who are most socially excluded in South Africa, those most excluded from the economy, are those who are most politically included because they vote for the ruling party. That's been a paradox. I think that paradox is going to break, and that those most socially excluded are going to be those most politically apathetic. And that's a very important event in South African history if that does indeed occur. I also suspect that middle-class people will start returning to the polls in greater numbers, and they'll do so to vote against the ANC. So, ironically, it won't be the people of Marikana who are going to unseat the ANC, but they will perhaps create the space for a middle-class constituency to unseat the ANC. I would say that the ANC, starting from this next election in 2014, are going to see the writing on the wall, and that by 2019, a significant split will have happened in the party. I think that the declining cachet of the ANC will be seen from within the organization. It may well split it. And that by 2019 or 2024, we may see the end of one-party rule in South Africa and the beginning of an era of coalition politics. And I think when the history is written, these are bold forecasts. Many forecasts don't come true, but why not throw it out there? I think it's a stark possibility. A dramatic consequence of that is a situation where a coalition is voted in by rich people, by middle-class people, in a situation where poor people are voting less and less. The consequences of that are important. And one is in labor relations. I think that the country doesn't realize how lucky it's been to have the ANC until now. How convenient it is that one organization can deliver an entire working class to work every day. One union movement can represent almost all of organized workers, negotiate in central bargaining councils, and deliver them all to work. I think that is going to change. I think that the capacity of COSATU to deliver the whole of the organized working class to a corporatist consensus in South Africa is going to end. And certainly civil servants and the upper echelons of skilled labor will remain COSATU and remain easily organizable. But I think that the rest of the working class is going to be much more volatile and fragmented, and South African employers are going to have to find another way of dealing with them. I think that new industrial relations structures will be necessary, new rules of engagement will be necessary. They're going to be very hard. They're going to be much more volatile than what we have now. It's hard to know what those rules of engagement are going to be, but they'll make the economy far more difficult to run than it is now. So I think the idea of explosion is lazy and perhaps silly, and blinds us to what might really happen. And I think what might really happen is much more glacial, much slower. It'll happen in increments, but no less important. And that in 10, 15 years from now, Marikana may well be seen as the beginning of a watershed. Thanks.
It may be just the perspective that I'm sitting from, but I'm just thinking that we have 4 South Africans and talking about this, and the name Julius Malema, I don't think has been mentioned yet. I mean, Johnny, can you? Is he important in this?
I mean, Julius Malema is very good at appearing at the scene of a crowd that he didn't conjure. And I think that somebody like that has a limited shelf life. You know, I think the interesting thing about Julius Malema is that for quite a long time, the ANC pretended not to like him when they did like him, because he was the classic court jester. He could say things the ANC wanted to say but couldn't. And here was the fiery young man who could talk tough, who could talk about an unfinished revolution, who could say to the masses, the ANC is not yet in power. We've been given office but not power. We want power. And that is something the ANC wanted to say but couldn't. So they outsourced that to the radical youth. Problem is they lost control of him. It's a dangerous game to play. Governing as the ANC is a dangerous game to play, as everybody has said in a different way.
Like any good jester, he knew what he was doing.
I do think, though, that Zuma will succeed where Mbeki failed with Zuma himself, in that I think if Zuma does win re-election at Mangaung, Malema will probably find himself in jail, possibly even before then. And I agree with Johnny. I don't think he has any longevity besides his sort of opportunism at the moment.
Okay. You heard it here first. Now, to give a sense of the impact of Marikana on South Africa from the outside, we have Natsanet Tesfaye, who's the head of Africa forecasting at Exclusive Analysis. And so as an outsider who has to give a value to South Africa, and it's already been downgraded, how do you see the impact of that incident?
Well, a number of points that I was going to speak on have been raised by Johnny. Forecasting, that's supposed to be my job. But thank you for your help. And raised by the other panelists who are from South Africa, so I'm sure it's much closer to their hearts and they're following this quite closely. But I do work with clients from all different sectors, from all different creeds, all different countries. And I have picked up on similar concerns amongst them. And what I do to respond to those concerns is observe trends. I monitor indicators and advise them where these indicators are likely to point towards. So what I would like to do now is highlight some of the indicators and trends that I've seen and raise the questions that I have for South Africa's future. But one thing that each of the panelists did bring up is that you are observing a trend of an intensification, increased frequency, and increasingly violent form of unrest, whether it's strike and industrial action or it's community protests in the country. And so this is in some sense, an electorate revolting against its government or trying to register their grievances at the very least. And that does bring to the fore questions about what does that mean for labor relations going forward? Is COSATU losing its relevance? Are unions generally losing their relevance? And how is that going to affect operations for companies investing there going forward? When looking at some of the numbers, and this is how we're able to look at trends, I mean, numbers may not be completely accurate, but they do provide a baseline. There's a number that I did come across that was, for me, quite shocking, which was in 2012, the number of protests per month was the highest since the end of apartheid. And these are community service delivery protests that Andrew had spoken about. So these are communities that feel as if they've become disenfranchised. How is the government going to try to capture them? Well, we've heard from the other panelists that Zuma's re-election at Manaung in December is pretty much certain at this point. So how is an electorate going to engage with a president they did not choose? Even if their form of protest is going to be voter absenteeism. Another question, in looking at the outlook for civil unrest, if you will, going forward, is we're also seeing contagion. And you've seen this before. You've seen this when you had the traditional strike season in South Africa. You've seen that season is no longer relevant. It's happening all throughout the year. But the contagion's happening much more quickly and leaping from sectors that don't seem as related, because you feel there's this level of sympathy amongst the unionized labor force and those who feel disenfranchised because they're not represented by unions, trying to rally together for what they feel are their just deserves. But for employers who may be sitting in manufacturing or maybe sitting in retail or maybe pharmaceuticals, they're currently sitting there thinking, when is my day going to come? Because you see that it's catching almost like a wildfire across the country. How is the government going to respond? How is the government likely to bring them on side? Is this government, most importantly, capable of doing that going forward? The Malema factor is what we kind of call it internally. I do think is relevant in the sense that Malema himself has become an indicator from what we've monitored. You find that when he goes to a mining site or an operational site where you've already seen that the workers have been trying to register grievances, they've released statements to the media, they've reprimanded their union that's meant to represent them. Within a couple of days of his arrival or his contacting them, there is a strike, an illegal, unprotected strike there. So he is providing some type of incitement, and I think that needs to be recognized. Whether or not that has a short lifespan is one question, but can he build a critical mass momentum before Manaung, before his incarceration or prosecution, in order to set fire to the ANC policy agenda? And I think that's the last bit that I would like to end on. How is the ANC going to react in terms of its policy agenda? Malema is harping on the nationalization agenda. He's harping on it and harping on it. And the ANC has responded that they are against outright nationalization, but may pursue strategic. What that means has been left ambiguous, but we're trying to find it out ourselves. But from our perspective, when we look at decisions and whether or not it's economic policy or foreign policy, often there's a political driver behind it, and it's our job to identify that for our clients. So we're seeing all these political drivers, and in which way are they going to shift the policy agenda? So what does that mean for nationalization? Is that back on the table? If Malema is able to build that critical mass before December, is the ANC forced to reckon with that, even though they said it's off the table previously? When looking at things like further drivers of civil unrest, you've had the rand is weakening because of the unrest. You find that the supply chain to exports has been disrupted. So this is leading to a situation where economic growth forecasts have been reduced. You've seen that inflation is increasing. These are other drivers for civil unrest. That means that those who feel as if they don't have enough money are paying more for the things that they think that they need. Are you going to find more protests because of that economically motivated unrest? For those who feel as if the growth forecasts are going to be reduced because of this, and we have already seen that certain mining firms have had to lay off workers, is mass retrenchment going to lead to a higher unemployment rate that itself is going to drive further unrest? So while I will shy away from reaching the conclusions of the Financial Times and the New York Times, it does seem as if the indicators are pointing towards more popular protests. And it may not be organized. We have not seen that really. It's grown more organically, but in itself that could be much more destabilizing to the ANC because there isn't a central committee or a central grouping leadership that you can speak to and negotiate with. This is much more of a bottom-up movement.
Richard. Richard, may I just put a point of clarification? That thing on Gwedi Mantashe. Gwedi Mantashe, the former General Secretary, is now the Secretary General of the ANC. It's James Matlatsi, the former President of the National Union of Mine Workers, who is now just retired as the Chairman of Anglo Gold. And also 270 of the miners who were arrested after the shooting have been charged with murder, which, as Pierre de Vos pointed out, is the most ludicrous situation about how do people murder themselves. However, that issue, after a massive protest, has now been put on hold, but they still face the charge.
Okay, we'll move to questions now. If you have a specific question for a specific speaker, please just say so. And we'll just start by taking them one by one, and then as we move on, maybe take them in threes. But let's start just one moment. Who'd like to ask the first question? Yeah.
Just sticking to.
Could you? Yeah. And could you give your name, please?
Yeah, hi, it's Gareth. Just sticking to the economic perspective, what do you think this has as an impact on foreign investment?
I think that's one for you, Nadsna.
You've already seen from my direct interactions with clients who are directly investing in South Africa, the plans for expansion of further investment have already been put on hold. Again, this is what leads to the Reserve Bank governor already forecasting that growth is not going to be what was originally projected. You find that companies are also thinking about their exposure, considering other ANC policies that have already been put forward, such as expansion of Transnet. So if you're more reliant on parastatals or firms that are directly associated with the ANC, what is your exposure to risks related to that could stem from that? So it does lead to a reconsideration. Another point that I forgot to raise is that, I mean, there's been a trend where, the Eurozone seems to be crashing, and the US had high unemployment. The economy there didn't seem good, and all of a sudden Africa seemed like this glimmering destination for investment. And for most of the more cautious investors, South Africa seemed like the best place to set up a footprint before expanding into the continent. That's no longer the case. I find that clients are asking me now about Gabon or Ghana or other countries, which is interesting from my perspective, that there is more knowledge or more desire to expand to other footholds, but understanding that South Africa's appeal is waning because of that is definitely something to note. And what does that mean for economic growth forecasts for next year, 2015, 2019, in terms of the expansion plans for the government?
That's fascinating. Yes. Yeah, another question here in the...
Thank you. My name's George Lakeem. Just a question for Terry. I've been in contact with a lot of the CEOs of mining companies in the last few days, and they're saying to me they're getting to a kind of a solution. So maybe to Audrey's point is that we're getting some progress being made. But they've been hampered by a political movement. What is the link between what's going on today and the conference in December?
Well, it's not a question of the political movement. At the moment, the thing is, quite honestly, it's not only complex, it's a mess. What you have is many of the mine workers have turned, who were members of the National Union of Mine Workers. I mean, at Lonmin, 70% of the workers were actually members of the National Union of Mine Workers. They've rebelled against that. Now, NUM has actually said, that's the other thing that I found appalling, they turned around, they said this is one of these new unions sponsored by the Chamber of Mines, AMCU, the Association of Mine Workers. In fact, it was a union that was a breakaway from NUM, a very interesting breakaway actually, in 1998. It's been around for quite some time. That's not the issue at all. You now have a whole lot of individual groups coming together. Actually, one could argue being organized the way unions are supposed to be organized, democratically electing people to go and speak, etc. Now, NUM is trying now desperately to claw back, and you have some vitriolic attacks on mushroom unions, on the fact that the Chamber of Mines, the big capitalists, that was the Communist Party came up with that today, the big capitalists are trying to wreck the trade union movement. So I don't think, what is happening, if you look, the 15,000 mine workers at Anglo Gold faced the sack this week.
In Goldfields.
So, in Goldfields rather, yes. The point is that I don't see anything settling down at this stage. What will happen is, as often happens with strikes of this nature, people get themselves starved back to work. And that may well happen. What it's going to mean, of course, I think, and I think Johnny would agree with, with this, that there's going to be a lot more violence. Because those people have no place to go, nothing to lose. So I can't see that there is any real move towards a settlement. Look, you talk settlement in the hope, it's wish fulfillment. I quite honestly can't see it at the moment.
Yeah, because also just at the end of last week or the beginning of this week sometime, there was the Chamber of Mines made an offer on the gold, in the gold strike. I spoke to the trade unions. They were very confident, actually, that that it was going to be accepted, and it wasn't. And the vitriol that you're talking about is very, very recent, because before this, they were utterly complacent, as a matter of fact, in their response to what was going on. And they felt that, you know, people will recognize that those unions can't offer them the things that they promised them anyway, and then they'll come back to the fold. And I think that was the attitude, in a way, of the ANC also towards the South African electorate, and I think that is going to break down as well.
There's also another factor too. It's an inter-union thing, that we have one industry, one union, but there have always been problems with overlaps, which is understandable. On the mines, for example, a welder or someone doing metal work joined the National Union of Metal Workers. Now, what is happening, a lot of these mine workers are not going, if they want to remain unionized, are not going away from NUM to AMCU. They're trying to join NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers, which is creating tremendous tension within COSATU. Because don't forget one thing too, and that is that trade unions in South Africa are now big business. We're talking about subscriptions running into tens of millions of rand a month. So these are also complicating issues.
We've got sort of flurry of questions. So I'll take, I'll take three, one after the other. Okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Paul. We've heard about the conditions of the workers, mine workers, terrible as they are. But I just want us to focus on the mining companies for a second. It seems to me that the mining companies are a law unto themselves, and by this I mean that they seem to be unregulated as far as labor rights are concerned. They seem to be very confident in firing 24,000 people. You know, it's nothing to them. You know, now there's been a mention of previous union bosses getting onto boards of these companies. Is there money being exchanged between the mining companies and government or the ANC? Are these former union bosses the point men for these mining companies? You know, and can that be broken? You know, could it be that is what where the problem lies? If we were to see any regulation of labor in South Africa.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, one just here.
Merle Lipton. It's a question for Johnny and for Andrew.
Can you hear at the back? Yeah, hold it a bit closer.
It's a question for Johnny and Andrew about the position of COSATU.
No, it's got switched off, I think, on the...
Oh, that way.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
A question for Johnny and Andrew about the position of COSATU. I suggest that it's not just a question of the leaders having become part of the establishment, though that is an important point, nor just a question of the bargaining system, which excludes minority unions, but it has to do with the structural position of unionized workers in a situation of mass unemployment. However unfair the earnings of the rock drillers and others, and they are unfair in relation to the earnings of the executives. There is a terrible disparity. But at least they have jobs. And in terms of incomes in South Africa, those are wages, as you know, well above the average. They are also internationally making South Africa's exports uncompetitive. One has a lot of big problems there. But the point I'm getting at is the structural position of unionized labor in a situation of mass unemployment. And I think the most urgent job for South Africa is not the position of the unionized workforce, which I in no way say is not important, and should be, and I agree, should be seen in relation to the incomes of the bosses, but the position of the unemployed. The priority should be them and the creation of mass employment, which the unions, unfortunately, are actually an obstacle to, as was evident in matters such as public works programs and the youth wage subsidy.
Okay, and a third one, yes, the lady on the end.
Thank you. Actually, you very passingly alluded to the question I was going to ask, but I'd like you to expand on that. And that is...
Could you give us your name, please?
Oh, sorry, Karina Litvak. And I work for an investment company that has investments in South Africa, so we're very interested, particularly in your comments, ma'am. So one of the things that we've spotted is the fact that there are competing trade unions, and that the bargaining arrangements exclude all but one. There has to be one dominant union in any workplace. So unlike any other country in the world, where if you have different trades that are members of different unions, each representative has a seat at the table, and it's therefore possible for management to strike deals with all these different representatives. In this case, only one union gets to speak for the totality of the workers, which of course creates a very fraught environment. And I just wonder if you have any comments on whether that might, resolving that problem might actually introduce an opportunity for resolving some of these conflicts.
Okay. Thank you very much. Who would like to pick up on these? Johnny? Yeah?
Well, I mean, you make an important point, and I agree with some of it, but not all. Over the last 18 years, unionized workers' average wage increase has been significantly higher than non-unionized workers. And for at least the sort of top 60% of unionized workers, much higher than inflation too. So COSATU has done extremely well for its members. And the question arises whether that has pushed down, firstly, the wages of people who aren't its members, and secondly, set up barriers to employment. And the answer is probably yes. I think that capital's response to a very strong, well-organized labor movement has been to invest more and more in capital rather than labor, inevitably. So yes, I think strong unionism has probably, in some sectors, curtailed employment. I think, though, that to say that the answer is to employ people in any way and at any cost, to rip up labor legislation, to allow people on one-month contracts, creates problems of its own. And I think that that's what's happening in the platinum industry. Some of the people on strike are well paid, some are not, because as Terry points out, they're contract workers. And what they see at the end of the month is 4,000 or 5,000 rand. Their conditions of employment are incredibly fragile and uncertain. And I think that if you throw away the rule book and employ people on any terms in order to, with the rationale of employing more people, you put people in jobs, but they're in the jobs of such hardship and instability and fragility that they bring instability into the heart of the economy. And so I think that the Democratic Alliance's standard answer to how to create employment, which is to rewrite labor legislation, is something that should be approached with extreme caution.
Okay, thanks. Who else would like to pick up on either of the other?
I'd like to pick up on, yes, I'd like to pick up on the one down here regarding regulation. We have pretty good legislation. Our labour regulations are pretty good. Our Labour Relations Act, I think, is amongst the best anywhere. The point is, it's how much these things are implemented. We still have on the mind some of the most horrific number of deaths and injuries. We have a fantastic problem with silicosis, the dust disease, which to a degree that no other, I don't think any other, including China. China's got a better record than we have now, and that's saying something. In terms of being in the pockets of one another, of course, people have moved from the trade union movement. We have people like Johnny Copeland, who was the General Secretary of the Textile Workers, with Marcel Golding, who was the Deputy General Secretary of the Mine Workers Union, who came together and formed Hoskin Consolidated Investments, who are now both billionaires, along with Irene Charnley, who was also in the National Union of Mine Workers. That's happened.
Former Labour Minister was now on the board of Anglo.
Correct. But we can just rattle them off. However, a very interesting thing, just before I came over here, I attended the COSATU National Congress. It was a huge event, and in fact, people got given more than just the ordinary tracksuit. They got 2 tracksuits and a trundle bag and all that sort of thing, because Patrice Motsepe, who happens to be the biggest black mine owner with Rainbow Minerals, contributed 1.7 million rand to
Whose
the
sister
Cosatu
is married
Congress.
to the Minister of Justice, who's also in mining.
Well, as you know, Audrey, we keep saying, look, our Minister of Intelligence, his wife was done for being a major drug dealer, and he said he didn't know. So, I mean, because we can't have, we are a truly egalitarian and non-sexist country, so what our wives or husbands or spouses get up
business,
to,
yeah.
it's their own business, yes.
Money's being exchanged then.
No, not necessarily. For example, the mining companies will give to NUM, as they did at Marikana. They will give them office space. The full-time shop stewards will be full-time. They'll be paid their normal wage and topped up by the mining companies as well, but they will not actually go down the mine. And it is there that the first shootings allegedly took place. I was given a report by one of the monitors from Benchmarks who said that the group of miners were marching down. He wasn't there, so this is one reason that I felt we had to be cautious about it. But he said that 2 security guards came out of the National Union Mine Workers office and opened fire, killing 2 of the strikers who were marching on the mine. Subsequently, some police officer, whoever he must have been, sent in 2 coppers to go and arrest the people responsible. Well, they got chopped to pieces. Photographs were taken of that, and some of the police, and there have been interviews of this, were really bitter. They were going all out to get revenge. That's the whole background. People in one another's pockets, but much more subtly than giving bribes.
No, but there's also the whole matter of exactly the redeployment argument and seizing the commanding heights of the economy argument, which is when Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, the whole idea was to transform the economy, and this was going to be done through black economic empowerment. So all these people were going to go into these huge big conglomerates, break them up, or there was going to be a component where black people would own them and control them, and maybe change the way in which big business operates in South Africa. Now that was never really said, was it? So the fact that we have these very high level ANC cadres, as they call them, right in bed with these companies was actually an ANC policy, and it's still not a policy that's been abandoned. That was what the ANC was actually intending, because it was meant to allow a black-owned stake in the economy of South Africa. I mean, I think somebody memorably said, we're not interested in spaza shops. So those are sort of corner shops. South Africa is not interested in corner shops or black South Africans. They're interested in owning the mines and taking control of all of these things. And of course, somebody else also. The Smart Ngonyama, I don't know if you remember him, former ANC spokesperson, who said, we didn't struggle to be poor. Well, he was talking about himself. He wasn't talking about everybody else. Not that Smart Ngonyama is in any way, I'm not saying that he's corrupt or anything like that. I'm just saying that the attitude was that, those people who had sort of ANC people, this was what they intended. They wanted to be captains of industry,
Okay, yeah.
I think very quickly, I'm not going to comment any further on Merle's point. I share very similar views to Johnny's. I think it's a very complex issue, but it is the nub of the issue of employment in South Africa, and the political alliance between COSATU and the ANC obviously complicates it a lot further. And we could talk about that in a discussion on its own for many hours. I just want to make the point that from what both Audrey and Terry have said, it is my view that the biggest problem that we face globally about the way we are governed and about the nature of global politics is the role of money in politics. And South Africa is no exception. It's also not unique in this sense. And you're hearing from Audrey all of these examples, and there are countless others of these sorts of interconnections, because what the ANC has become, rather than an organization that is divided factionally on the basis of ideology, sometimes even principled position, it's become an organization that is largely factionalized by different groupings wanting to get their hands on power because of the money and patronage that is involved with that power. And this is something that happens everywhere in the world. Now, South Africa has a number of problems that exacerbate it, again, not unique. The fact that there is absolutely no transparency about financial contributions to political parties is a very serious problem. And I think that the way in which money percolates between, be it the mining houses, or companies in general and the political class happens through a variety of formal and informal mechanisms. But that it is happening, there is absolutely no doubt. The final thing I want to say is when I moved from a provincial legislature to the national parliament, I actually took over Johnny's seat in Parliament, Johnny Copeland's seat. Johnny went on to become probably a multi-billionaire. I went on to be kicked out of Parliament and described as probably one of the few people in South Africa who made nothing out of the arms deal.
Could I just answer the one on the agency?
Yeah.
The point about it is, yes, we have what are called agency agreements, and they create an extraordinary amount of problem. And one of the problems that exacerbated the situation in the platinum mines and on the gold mines is the fact that if you have a minority union, and it could be a union that has 30%, they still not only are not represented, they have to give half of their subscription to the union that represents them, allegedly, at the bargaining council. This happens in the transport industry. It's been a major problem, particularly in the Western Cape. So yes, that is an area that we have to deal with.
Okay. Wow. Okay. All right, this time we'll go to the back. Yeah, the question there.
Dele, and I have to, Dele Fatima from the Royal African Society. The question I wanted to ask you is that we've talked a lot about the ANC and South Africa and the way it's shaping the country. It sounds very interesting to me because it sounds exactly like Nigeria or any post-independence African country. And the question I have is, what's the actual solution? What's the counterweight to the ANC's essential decline and corruption? Because if COSATU isn't going to break away from the ANC, where do you see there being a counterweight? Because if the ANC decides to destroy the Constitutional Court, or I guess the question I'm asking is, how close do you think you are to the prospect of an authoritarian state in South Africa?
Okay. Yeah. Yes, the lady there at the back. Yes.
Two questions, really, very quickly. I was just a little bit surprised that none of you seemed to characterize what happened at Marikana as a class struggle, just to kind of use Marxist terminology here. But if anything heartening came out of this tragedy to me was that there was some sort of labor movement that was, that made the headlines, and it's certainly something that we haven't seen in a while. And I just wonder whether you could comment more on that. And then secondly, I wonder what was the general public reaction to the massacre? I mean, so was it met with universal revulsion? Were people universally just horrified by this? And if so, wouldn't that be a moment perhaps to be seized on, a moment maybe of national reconciliation where people come together and say, hey, maybe now's the time to kind of all stand up together and do something against, the powers that have made life so intolerable as it is. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, two questions, and one, yes, one over the other, yeah.
Hi. My name's Samantha Bolton. I work on PR campaigns for public and private clients, mostly in Africa. And one of the things that, just another thing that I think was quite shocking from the public perspective was the fact that when the Goodman Gallery had that portrait of Zuma, and, with the sort of, what was it called? The spear with a gun in the place of his dick or whatever. But anyway, the point was
dick
that...
in the place of his dick.
Yeah. That made worldwide news. And I think that and the mining issue was really like the beginning of the end, because it really showed that what you had was essentially a tin pot dictator. I mean, their behavior of sending in a heavy white and black guy to black over the painting and destroy it, of some small little gallery, it was just extraordinary. And when you talk to people outside, they say, oh, well, actually, what's weird about South Africa when you go there is it's like the south of the US. Nice roads, Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, it's really like nowhere else in Africa. And what a lot of people are now saying is, oh, well, it's just like the rest of Africa. You have a tin pot dictator, the rule of law means nothing, this constitution is out the window. And essentially, maybe that's the case, And when people, I was in Zimbabwe in June, and it's heaving with people doing business. But they understand that the rule of law means nothing. You come in, you bribe, you pay the minister, you get your job done. So maybe that's where we're at in South Africa, that it's just gone back to being like the rest of Africa. And many countries like Nigeria or wherever, Congo, making some progress. But it's slow, and you still essentially bribe, and that's it.
Yeah, okay. I think we'll come on take because these are mainly comments. So we'll.
I'd like to respond to that.
Okay. All right. I'll take just two more, and then we'll get some responses. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted. Oh, hi. I'm Gillard Isaacs, a PhD student. To be picking up on the issue of class polarization. I'm not surprised by what we've seen. When capital's faced with these sorts of opposition, there seems to be three responses. There is force, the co-option of the Labour leadership, and concessions, and all three have been major. And for a short time, it'll work. I think even on a limited economic level, it'll work. Then we'll see extra mechanization in the mines. We'll see layoffs and exacerbated unemployment. And I think there's a broader process here of the class of class polarization, which I'd like to ask you guys what you think the risks are. It appears to me just that there's a host, two which I'll throw out there for comment. One is that whilst Malema might not be him risk as the man, he seems to occupy this demagogical role which others like him can mobilize that polarization. I'll leave it there because I see you nodding at me.
Okay, all right, thanks. Let's have some reactions. So yes, we've got an authoritarian state yet, class war, general public reaction, just
Any
like the
chance
rest
of
of
one more
Africa
question
and
or
Zuma's dick.
one more
So,
comment?
I think we'll have time for another quick round. I mean, I don't know what the time frame is here, but I think we're enjoying ourselves. Nobody's leaving. So, yeah. Okay, yeah. Right. Let's go quickly round. Yes,
okay,
quickly. Audrey.
Authoritarian state, yes. Actually, I think South Africa is an authoritarian state. I think the ANC has always had authoritarian instincts. If you look at the history, how it's dealt with dissent, etc. I'm sorry, Andrew. But
I didn't feel personally responsible.
You did represent it in Parliament, though. Yeah. The Labour movement, actually the Labour movement is one, somebody who said it's heartening to see the Labour movement making headlines anywhere in the world. Well, the Labour movement in South Africa regularly makes headlines, and they do reach the rest of the world, I think, simply because of the number of strikes that you had, the strike season that you were referring to. For a couple of years before people realized there was a strike season, you know, the unrest in South Africa would bring out that trope that Johnny was talking about, you know, are we on the verge of collapse or not? In fact, that's happened very early in in the new South Africa's history, 94, 95, 96, period of huge instability in South Africa. Actually, there were massive strikes all the time. And that sense of South Africa being on the edge was there even then. Public reaction. Now, this is interesting for me because at first I think that the National Union of Mine Workers and Jacob Zuma and the ANC generally thought they could get away with slurring mine workers by saying that they drank, that they visited faith healers that made them believe that they were impervious to bullets, and they were heavily armed, and they were provocative, and they were attacking the police. And of course, there's the small matter of the 2 police who had been killed earlier. The problem with that was that people then started saying, but mine workers, that their strikes, they usually have blankets and weapons. They often drunk, because it's one of the studies that was conducted into violence on the mines in South Africa found that alcohol plays a massive role in the amount of violence that you have in the mines. So the questions were, these mine workers, and yet you sent police to go and confront them. You knew that in itself was a provocative act. So people started asking those questions, like, why did you deal with it the way you did? You are supposed to be the party that represents these people. You are supposed to be the party that knows these people. How come you could have miscalculated so badly? And then the public started changing their reaction to it and saying, well, actually, you were wrong. Mine workers, yes, there were all these other things going on, but you really should have dealt with it in a completely different way. So the feelings towards mine workers turned, because don't forget also mine workers occupy a very difficult space in South African townships. They often come from elsewhere. They live in compounds. They don't live as very often within the community itself. They're removed from the community. They're very different to the ordinary township dwellers very often. Well, that was the case up until maybe 10 years ago when more and more people started settling. But by and large, it's still the case that mine workers come from outside, from rural areas of South Africa and live separate lives within the township. So I think that the official response was they thought they could count on people's knee-jerk reactions to mine workers, and it didn't work.
Okay.
Well, I'll be very brief. How close to authoritarianism? I don't think that South Africa is an authoritarian state yet. And I think there's a possibility that it could become one, or it might go the other way. At the moment, if I had to lay bets, I'm not getting into the forecasting business, but I used to be a gambler. If I had to lay bets, I'd give the odds on going authoritarian before things straighten out, hopefully. That's one. Marikana is a class struggle. Of course, a class struggle. These are workers who are rebelling against their bosses, and the people who seem to such every small left-wing group in South Africa is into Marikana now. They weren't there when Andries Tatane was killed. A few of them turned up. They weren't there when Kuruman burst forth. We now have the Democratic Socialist Movement, the Democratic Left Front, the ISO, all in there assisting the mine workers. Well, I really don't think it's going to go anywhere. But we acknowledge it's a class struggle. You don't have to spell it out in Marxian terms. Of course it's a class struggle. And it could be played badly, as Julius Malema did. He used the class feelings to play the race card. He turned it against white capital in a manner that Jane Duncan, the academic from who's former trade unionist from Rhodes University, called proto-fascism, and which I said was actually the beginnings of our homegrown version of fascist ideology. As regards the spear, yes, disgusting. But what's even more disgusting is that Jacob Zuma is still suing our finest political cartoonist, Jonathan Zapiro, for his cartoon about the rape of justice. I don't know if anyone has ever seen it. Yes. With them all holding down and Jacob Zuma saying Anyhow, he sued Jonathan for 2 cartoons for 15 million. He dropped it to 10. Jonathan was very disappointed. But the point is the case is scheduled to come up next month. I have it on good authority, and I can't say that it's guaranteed, that certain legal friends approached certain other legal friends and suggested a quiet settlement on the basis that if Jonathan Shapiro would apologize, which of course he will not do. Therefore, just before Mangaung, this court case is going to come up, and Jacob Zuma is going to have egg all over his face, I think. Anyhow, that's it.
Also, I'll try and be as quick as possible. A couple of points. I don't think South Africa is yet an authoritarian country. I think it's heading in that direction. I certainly don't think it's a tin pot dictatorship, if I understand the sort of general parlance of what that means. I also must say that sorry, first let me say, the reason that I don't feel that is that I think that there are some counterweights, to come to one of the earlier question that was made. And look, as you've probably gathered, and any of you who've read my work would understand, I don't really spare my former colleagues much criticism. But there are certain things in South Africa that I think we should be proud of. I think we have a remarkable investigative media, not without problems, as Terry has just outlined, and it is a constant struggle. But the number of schools of investigative journalism that now exist, be it at Wits, at Stellenbosch, the University of Johannesburg, and which are oversubscribed with extraordinary young students wanting to become investigative journalists. And the standard of investigative journalism that we see on a weekly basis, I think, is very important. The relative independence of the courts remains extremely important in South Africa. I don't think it's completely clear-cut. I think there are certain indications that things in the legal fraternity are also becoming more difficult, not least of which are the ruling party's attacks on the judiciary. But I think that the courts have made some extremely important rulings against the government throughout all of the years of our democracy, and we should bear that in mind. I also just want to say that I have slight problems when we look at Africa as this one monolithic entity. Africa is a continent of, I think, 54 countries now, and to talk about Cape Town and Cairo in the same breath is a little bit like talking about Surrey and Sarajevo, and they're all European and therefore they're all the same. And I think we really need to guard against that, because I think there is a long history of the way that Africa is analyzed and written about and reported that we need to be conscious of. And the final point I want to make on that is that let us not forget, my area of work is corruption, and particularly in the global arms trade. That, I talk about $300 million being paid in bribes on the South African deal, which was the case. Let me tell you, that's chicken feed in the global trade in arms, okay? And who is doing the corrupting? Well, the most corrupt arms companies in the world involved in Africa sit in China, Russia, but more importantly, in Germany and in the United Kingdom. And there is as much likelihood as BAE Systems facing justice for its constant and continuing corruption as there is of Jacob Zuma facing justice for his corruption in relation to the South African arms deal. And we should never lose sight of that. And finally, let me say, coming back to the issue of class polarization and class struggle, in endorsing Terry's comment, I was shocked and shamed to read Jacob Zuma's opening remarks to the MK Veterans Association just the other day. I bring you revolutionary greetings from the National Executive Committee of the ANC. Now, this has to be the richest bunch of revolutionaries that I've ever come across.
On the question of authoritarianism, I think that South Africa's saving grace is that the ANC is ungovernable.
It's ungovernable now.
The ANC it's an organization of more than 1 million members, and it has acquired a taste for throwing out its leaders. And that is very, very important. I think that once the ruling party acquires a taste for throwing out its leaders, so does the country as a whole. And a very, very important aspect of post-apartheid history is that we've had 4 presidents. 4 presidents in 18 years. That's a lot. At least one of those was ejected by a popular party, by a transparent democratic procedure in his party. That is extremely important. And I think that what happened in Marikana speaks to the same syndrome, very optimistically. Terry, you're right, that the question of saying who pulled the trigger and why is not the only question, but it is an important question. And the question is that Jacob Zuma pulled the trigger. And the question of why is very, very important. Very briefly, between 2004 and February 2011, 8 South Africans were killed by police in public protests. From February 2011, for the next 6 months until July, 12 people were killed, more than in the previous decade. Why? And the reason is that these paramilitary outfits that had been trained to take on armed combatants were turned on protesters. And they were turned on protesters by Jacob Zuma. It was a police policy decision that came from the presidency to put these people in front of protesters and shoot with live ammunition. That happened under Zuma's watch, and it happened because he allowed it, because he wanted it. Why did he want it? Because service delivery protests across the country were making him feel very brittle and very nervous. This was his way to try and stamp his control over the edges of the tripartite alliance, to try and discipline it. And look at what's happened. It led to Marikana. It led to the greatest legitimacy crisis the ANC has faced, since 1912. This is what happens when an ANC leader tries to stamp authority using authoritarian means. It backfires. I think it's going to keep backfiring.
Which is what he used in exile, incidentally.
Yeah. Just on the point of bribery and corruption, since that is becoming an increasing concern by companies, maybe not by will, but by law in the UK, and those who are registered in the US. So it is something they need to take into account, and they will be held accountable for. So there's a concern that, as most of the panelists have recognized, that the political environment will continue in the leadership as it is now. So Zuma will most likely get a second term, and it will be his last. And there are a lot of question marks that are racking up next to his name due to allegations of corrupt dealings, about political appointments, preferential treatment. How is he going to handle that last term? Is he going to set up himself to leave South Africa with a legacy of a more positive presidency, or is he going to set it up so that he can leave himself with a legacy of not being followed up with by the next government in the form of corruption probes and prosecutions? So that is one of the particular concerns going forward about what is going to be the level of bribery and corruption. Is there going to be a reduction as there's more light shed or more attention on South Africa, or is it actually going to entrench practices that we've seen so far?
Okay, thanks very much. Now, just very, very quick, but a few very quick comments. Yeah, the gentleman there, because I nearly just cut you off last time. So, but very, very quickly, because we're really running out of time.
I mean, I'll try and be as brief as I possibly can. I think that...
Could you give us your name?
Yes, Nimrod Zalk, currently a student here in London. I think one of the areas that's been brushed over completely, or very much, I think, has been the issue of economic policy, except in as much as suggesting that what South Africa's really had is state-of-the-art economic policy, particularly macroeconomic policy, and that where we failed, which is true, is on the delivery of social policy. And I think we really need to revisit that, and the idea that nothing's changed since 1994 in the structure of the economy, except for how things have been divvied up. Part of the elite bargain that has happened from 1994 has been a massive change in the economy, where most of the growth has been in the financial sector and in
Can you be very quick, because we
credit,
are at the end.
consumption, credit-driven growth. This has had undermined the productive side of the economy, which is really at the heart of why we have been unable to create jobs. And notwithstanding the fact that there's been de jure kind of protection of labor rights, de facto there hasn't. And still it hasn't generated massive employment gains.
Okay, thanks very much. And the lady at the front, and then that, I'm afraid, is going to be it. This is the last comment. Please make it brief.
I'm Carol Story. I'm a photojournalist, and I spent a lot of time in Africa. So I'm going to ask one very simple question, very short, for the entire panel. One of the areas that we have not discussed tonight is the humanitarian issues that have been addressed or not addressed of the mine workers and other labor workers in
what issues?
Humanitarian.
The
humanitarian issues. The application, very simply, because I'm quite familiar with what the mining conditions are in Africa. I've been down those mines, and I can tell you they're horrific, and you have kids going down there. There's tremendous humanitarian issues that also are affecting people's lives in the most significant way. And I'm just interested in how you feel what has happened recently is also perhaps going to impact in a positive way to trigger positive change in humanitarian issues.
Okay. All right. Would anybody like to pick that up? Yeah. Audrey.
Apparently, all of us, right? You want to respond? One of the conditions that the Chamber of Mines agreed to in trying to settle the unprotected strike in the gold mining industry recently was that they were going to look into the conditions of mine workers. I asked the spokesperson, don't you know the conditions under which mine workers live? Quite simply, don't we know? I mean, because this is exactly what the mine workers have been saying and saying over and over again. And that's part of the reason why there was this horrible incident at Marikana.
I think it's going to have a positive impact because the mining companies now have been shamed in many ways, asking that simple question about how can you still, 18 years down the line, still have these single-sex hostels? It's ridiculous, let alone the rates of pay. And the conditions, as you say, are appalling. Our death and accident rate is shocking by any world standards, the worst in the world, which should not happen in a place like that. The excuse is, well, we're down to 4 kilometers under the earth, etc. These are people working in 40 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but anyhow, 40, 45 degrees. It's unbelievable, the conditions. People are now, for the first time, because of Marikana, being made aware of it. But these conditions have been like this all the time. Where, one has to ask, has the National Union of Mine Workers been? Did they not know what the conditions were. And then we get back again to the fact of the use of contract labor. COSATU has a major campaign to ban all labor brokers, all temporary employment services, which actually is ridiculous when you think about it, because you actually do have to have for certain things, particularly agriculture, so you do need that. We actually have in our Labour Relations Act section 198, which covers that quite well. It needs to be tightened up a bit, but it's a very good thing. It's just not implemented. But no one actually protested about the contract workers on the mines. And I think this is going to be very good for us from that point of view. It's a little bit of silver lining of a very dark cloud.
We're still just going to investigate it.
Yeah.
Yep. Anything? Yeah.
Just to build on Terry's point, is the problem is not the existence of legislation, but the political will to actually implement it. And we must not forget that we're 2 years and a bit away from an election. You're a couple of months away from the ruling party's election. So the leadership's already in the mode of winning hearts and minds. So it is one of the concessions that is likely to be granted, which is just implementing what's already been legislated or regulated for in terms of the basic treatment and living conditions for those workers in the hopes of gaining more or garnering more support and votes.
Very quick comment. I'd very much like to have a whole discussion about economic policy, but maybe afterwards we can talk more about it, because we can't at the moment. Just to say, I hope that Terry is right, but I'm slightly skeptical that companies will only do anything if there is enough continued focus on the sorts of humanitarian issues that led to Marikana and that are leading to the level of social protests. And that only comes through active citizenship, through a very good investigative media. And that's where effort and investment needs to take place in South Africa.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, panel. I think that really has to be the last word. I don't think I've been a very authoritarian probably on the contrary, but I am going to abuse my position to just give a little plug for RAS, for the Royal African Society's Film Africa Festival. 70 films over the 10 days beginning on November the 1st, so hope to see you there and back here before long.
Is it going to be on the website?